The hospital receptionist said I wasn't listed as the patient's daughter. Then I heard my stepmother telling doctors she'd been caring for my father alone for years. I stood at the emergency room desk holding my phone with 17 missed calls from an unknown number. The receptionist looked at her screen and shook her head. I'm sorry, but I don't see you listed as family for Gerald Whitmore. Are you sure you have the right patient? My hands started shaking because I'd been Gerald Whitmore's daughter for 28 years. I showed her my driver's license with his address from before I moved out. She typed something and frowned. The only family contact we have is his wife, Diane Whitmore. She's listed as his primary caregiver and medical decision-maker. My father had married Diane 3 years ago after my mother died from cancer. I'd met her twice at awkward dinners where she smiled too much and asked invasive questions about my job and whether I planned to get married soon. Dad seemed happy, though, so I kept my distance and let them build their life together. There must be a mistake. I'm his daughter, his only child. Can you please tell me what happened to him? The receptionist glanced at someone behind me and lowered her voice. He collapsed at home this morning. Possible stroke. His wife brought him in and she's with the doctors now discussing his care plan. I walked past the desk toward the ICU wing before anyone could stop me. A nurse tried to redirect me, but I told her I was Gerald Whitmore's daughter and needed to see him immediately. She checked a tablet and gave me the same confused look. Mrs. Whitmore didn't mention a daughter. She said she's been his sole caregiver since his diagnosis 6 months ago. The words hit me like cold water. Diagnosis. 6 months. My father had been sick for half a year and nobody told me. I tried calling him every few weeks, but he rarely answered. When he did, he said he was busy with home projects and promised we'd get together soon. The nurse led me to a consultation room instead of his bedside. She said the doctor would speak with me shortly and closed the door. I sat there staring at my phone, scrolling through messages I'd sent Dad over the past months, texts asking about his health, inviting him to dinner, sending him articles I thought he'd enjoy. His responses were brief and distant. Now I understood why. Through the door, I heard Diane's voice in the hallway. She was talking to someone in that overly sweet tone she used at our dinners. It's been so difficult managing everything alone. The medications, the physical therapy, the dietary restrictions. But I promised Gerald I'd take care of him no matter what. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Diane stood with 2 doctors, her hand dramatically placed over her heart. She wore expensive athleisure clothes and her hair was professionally styled. When she saw me, her expression shifted from performative concern to genuine annoyance. Vanessa, what are you doing here? One of the doctors looked between us. You know each other? I stepped closer. I'm Gerald Whitmore's daughter. Why wasn't I notified that my father was sick? Why wasn't I called when he collapsed? Diane's face rearranged itself into sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, sweetie, your father didn't want to burden you. He knows how busy you are with your career. He specifically asked me not to contact you because he didn't want you to worry. The doctors were watching this exchange with clear discomfort. I turned to them directly. That's not true. I've been trying to reach my father for months. I had no idea he was sick. What's his diagnosis? The older doctor cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore suffered an ischemic stroke this morning. We're running tests to determine the extent of the damage. His wife has been providing us with his medical history. What medical history? I asked. Diane touched the doctor's arm gently. Could we discuss this privately? This is a very difficult time and I don't want to upset Gerald with family drama. I felt my jaw clench. There's no drama. I'm his daughter and I have a right to know what's happening. The younger doctor checked his tablet. According to our records, Mrs. Whitmore is listed as his healthcare proxy. She has the legal authority to make medical decisions on his behalf. I stared at Diane. When did that happen? She smiled sadly. Shortly after we got married. Gerald wanted to make sure someone could handle things if he became incapacitated. You were so distant, Vanessa. He didn't feel comfortable putting that responsibility on you. The accusation in her words was clear. She was painting me as the neglectful daughter who abandoned her father in his time of need. The doctors were already forming opinions based on her performance. I needed to see my father immediately and hear the truth from him. I want to see him now. Diane positioned herself between me and the ICU doors. He's resting. The doctor said he needs to remain calm. Seeing you unexpectedly might cause additional stress given your history. I turned to the doctors. What history? What has she been telling you? The older doctor looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitmore explained that you and your father have been estranged for several years, that you've had minimal contact and declined to be involved in his care. Every word was a lie, but she delivered it so convincingly that these medical professionals believed her without question. I pulled out my phone and showed them my call log. I've called him 43 times in the past 6 months. I've sent him texts every week. We're not estranged. I didn't know he was sick because nobody told me. The younger doctor examined my phone screen. Have you visited him during this time? He lives 2 hours away, and every time I suggested visiting, he said he was too busy. Now I know why. She was keeping us apart. Diane made a soft sound of distress. Vanessa, please. I know you're upset, but making accusations won't help your father. The truth is, you haven't been part of his daily life for years. I'm the one who's been here cooking his meals, managing his medications, taking him to appointments. Where were you during all of that? The question hung in the air, and I had no good answer. I'd been living my life, working my job, assuming my father was fine. I'd trusted that he would tell me if something was wrong. I'd never imagined someone would actively work to cut me out. A nurse approached and spoke quietly to the doctors. They nodded, and the older one turned to Diane. "He's awake. You can see him now." Diane thanked them and started toward the ICU. I followed, but she stopped and faced me. "I really think it's best if I see him first. Let me explain that you're here so he doesn't get confused or agitated." I pushed past her and kept walking. She called after me, but I was already through the doors. A nurse tried to intercept me, but I told her I was going to see my father, and she could either show me which room or I'd check every single one. He was in the third room, lying in bed with an IV in his arm and monitors beeping steadily. His face looked thinner than I remembered, and his skin had a grayish tinge. But when he saw me, his eyes widened with something that looked like relief. "Vanessa." His voice was weak and slightly slurred. I went to his bedside and took his hand. "Dad, I'm here. I came as soon as I found out." He squeezed my fingers and tears ran down his temples into his hair. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wanted to call you, but she said it would be easier if I didn't. She said you were busy building your life and I'd just be in the way." Diane entered the room and her entire demeanor changed. Her voice became sharp. "Gerald, you need to rest." The doctor said no stress. I didn't let go of his hand. "Dad, what's been happening? Why didn't you tell me you were sick?" He looked past me at Diane and something like fear crossed his face. "I thought it was better this way. Diane's been taking good care of me. She knows what I need." The words sounded rehearsed and hollow. I leaned closer. "Do you want me here? Tell me the truth." He started to answer, but Diane was suddenly at the other side of the bed, adjusting his blankets and checking his IV with exaggerated concern. "Darling, you're exhausted. You need to sleep so you can get better." She looked at me with cold eyes. "Vanessa, I think you should go. Your father needs to conserve his energy." I stayed exactly where I was. "I'm not leaving." A doctor entered and assessed the situation quickly. "I'm going to have to ask everyone to step outside. Mr. Whitmore needs rest and this environment is too stimulating right now." Diane nodded sympathetically. "Of course, doctor. We'll be in the waiting room if you need us." I looked at my father one more time. "I'll be right outside. I'm not going anywhere." In the waiting room, I sat as far from Diane as possible and started making calls. First to my father's lawyer, who I'd met once at a family gathering years ago. His secretary said he was in court but would call me back. Then to my father's longtime friend Richard, who'd known him since college. Richard answered on the second ring and sounded genuinely shocked to hear about the stroke. "I haven't seen Gerald in months." Diane said he wasn't feeling up to visitors. I tried calling, but she always answered and said he was sleeping or at an appointment. The pattern was becoming clear. Diane had systematically isolated my father from everyone who cared about him. I asked Richard if my father had seemed different before Diane came into his life. He was quiet for a moment. "After your mother passed, Gerald was lost. Diane appeared at exactly the right time. She was attentive and caring, and he needed that. But once they got married, things changed. He stopped coming to our poker games, stopped answering calls. The few times I did talk to him, he seemed distracted and tired. I thought he was just adjusting to married life. I thanked him and asked him to document everything he remembered about the past 3 years. He promised he would and said to call if I needed anything. The lawyer called back an hour later. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said one word: undue influence. He explained that if Diane had manipulated my father into signing documents while he was vulnerable or cognitively impaired, those documents could potentially be challenged. But we'd need evidence of her manipulation and proof that my father's wishes had been subverted. He said he'd review any legal documents my father had signed since the marriage and advised me to document every interaction with Diane and the medical staff. I spent the next 3 hours in that waiting room taking notes on my phone. Every conversation, every timeline detail, every instance of Diane controlling access to my father. A social worker appeared around 6 in the evening and asked to speak with me privately. In her office, she explained that she'd been assigned to my father's case and had some concerns about the family dynamics. "Mrs. Whitmore has been very involved in your father's care, which is wonderful. But some of her statements don't align with what we're seeing in his medical records. She claims he's been completely dependent on her for months, but his previous doctor's notes indicate he was fairly independent until recently." I leaned forward. "What else did you find?" The social worker chose her words carefully. "There are some inconsistencies in the medication records. Mrs. Whitmore provided a list of medications she says he's been taking, but they don't match what was prescribed by his primary care physician. Additionally, his financial records show some unusual activity that the hospital's billing department flagged." She slid a printout across the desk. It showed multiple charges to my father's credit card for medical equipment, home care services, and pharmacy bills. The amounts were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars over 6 months. "Has any of this been reported?" I asked. The social worker nodded. "We're required to report suspected elder abuse to the state. An investigator will be assigned to the case. In the meantime, I wanted you to be aware of what we've found. Your father is vulnerable right now, and we want to ensure he's protected." I thanked her and asked what I could do to help. She suggested I gather any financial or legal documents I could access and be prepared to speak with the investigator. She also recommended I consider filing for emergency guardianship if I believed my father was in danger. When I returned to the waiting room, Diane was gone. A nurse said she'd left to get dinner and would be back soon. I used the opportunity to go back to my father's room. He was awake and staring at the ceiling. When he saw me, he tried to smile, but it came out crooked because of the stroke. Vanessa, you're still here. I pulled a chair close to his bed. Of course I'm still here. Dad, I need you to tell me what's been happening. The truth. His eyes filled with tears again. I didn't want you to see me like this. Weak and sick and useless. You're not useless. You're my father and I love you. But I need to understand what Diane has been doing. He looked toward the door nervously. She's been good to me. She takes care of everything. I don't have to worry about anything. The words were automatic, like he'd been trained to say them. I took his hand. Dad, there are charges on your credit card for services that don't match your medical records. The hospital is investigating. If something's wrong, you need to tell me now so I can help you. His face crumpled. I can't think straight anymore. The medications make me foggy. Sometimes I don't remember whole days. Diane says it's normal, but I don't feel like myself. What medications is she giving you? He tried to remember but couldn't name them specifically. Little blue pills in the morning, white ones at lunch. She keeps them in her purse and gives them to me with my meals. I made notes on my phone. Does she ever give you pills that your doctor didn't prescribe? He hesitated. I don't know. She says they're all necessary. She says I'd be much worse without her taking care of me. The fear in his voice was obvious now. He was trapped and knew it, but didn't have the strength to fight back. Diane's voice came from the doorway. What are you doing? I turned to face her. Talking to my father. Something I should have been able to do months ago. She walked to the bed and put her hand on my father's shoulder possessively. Gerald, are you all right? Did she upset you? He shook his head weakly. I'm fine. She smiled at him tenderly, then looked at me with ice in her eyes. I think it's time for you to leave. You've been here all day and you're clearly upsetting him. If you don't go voluntarily, I'll ask security to escort you out. I stood my ground. The hospital social worker is investigating you. They found inconsistencies in Dad's medications and unusual financial activity. Whatever you've been doing, it's over. Diane's expression didn't change. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've done nothing but care for your father while you've been absent from his life. If there are any irregularities, I'm sure they're simple administrative errors. Now please leave before I call security. I looked at my father one more time. I'll be back tomorrow. I'm not abandoning you. In my car, I sat in the parking lot and called the lawyer back. I told him about the medications and the financial charges and the way Diane controlled every aspect of my father's life. He said it sounded like a clear case of elder abuse and financial exploitation. He'd start preparing paperwork for an emergency protective order and guardianship petition first thing in the morning. He also suggested I contact Adult Protective Services directly and file a formal complaint. I spent the next hour on the phone with a caseworker providing every detail I could remember. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my father lying in that hospital bed, trapped by his own wife, isolated from everyone who loved him. I thought about all the times I'd called and he hadn't answered, all the visits I'd suggested that never happened. Every excuse and delay had been Diane's manipulation keeping us apart. By dawn, I'd compiled a timeline documenting 3 years of isolation and control. I printed everything and organized it into a folder for the investigator. At 8 in the morning, I was back at the hospital with coffee I couldn't drink and determination I could barely contain. The receptionist recognized me and called someone before I could ask to see my father. A security guard appeared with a hospital administrator. The administrator smiled politely and asked me to step into her office. Inside, she explained that Diane had filed a formal complaint claiming I was harassing her and disturbing my father's recovery. I understand this is a difficult situation, but we need to prioritize the patient's well-being. Mrs. Whitmore has requested that you be restricted from visiting until her husband is stable. I pulled out my folder and placed it on her desk. Before you make that decision, I need you to look at this. Your social worker is already investigating suspected elder abuse. I have documentation showing a pattern of isolation, financial exploitation, and possible medical manipulation. Restricting my access plays directly into the abuser's hands. The administrator opened the folder and started reading. Her expression grew more serious with each page. She picked up her phone and called someone, asking them to come to her office immediately. 5 minutes later, the social worker from yesterday arrived along with the hospital's legal counsel. They reviewed everything while I sat there with my hands clenched in my lap. The legal counsel asked pointed questions about the timeline and the financial records. The social worker cross-referenced my documentation with her own notes. Finally, the administrator looked at me. We're going to allow you access to your father, but we're also going to have a security presence to ensure there are no confrontations. Mrs. Whitmore will be notified that you have permission to visit. In the meantime, our investigation continues and we'll be cooperating fully with Adult Protective Services. When I got to my father's room, Diane was already there. She saw me and her face hardened. I specifically asked that you be kept away from him. I walked to my father's bedside. The hospital denied your request. I have every right to be here. My father looked exhausted and confused. Diane had clearly been talking to him before I arrived, probably reinforcing her narrative about me being the problem. A security guard stood near the door watching us carefully. I ignored Diane and focused on my father. Dad, do you remember our conversation yesterday about the medications? He nodded slowly. Some of it. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app. Can you tell me what medications you're supposed to be taking according to your doctor? He struggled to remember. Diane interrupted. This is ridiculous. He's recovering from a stroke. You can't expect him to remember medical details right now. I kept my eyes on my father. Dad, try to remember. It's important. He closed his eyes with effort. Blood thinner. Something for blood pressure. Pain medication for my back. I wrote it down. Anything else your doctor prescribed? He shook his head. I don't think so. I turned to Diane. What's in the little blue pills you give him every morning? Her jaw tightened. His medication. Everything prescribed by his doctor. I looked at the security guard. The hospital is investigating discrepancies between what she claims he's taking and what was actually prescribed. I'd like someone from the pharmacy to review his current medications and verify them against his prescriptions. The guard radioed for a nurse. Within minutes, a hospital pharmacist arrived and requested the list of medications my father was currently taking. Diane reluctantly pulled a pill organizer from her purse. The pharmacist examined each compartment and made notes. She left to check the prescriptions on file and returned 15 minutes later with a printout. Her expression was grim. 3 of these medications were not prescribed by Mr. Whitmore's physician. One is a powerful sedative. Another is a muscle relaxant that can cause cognitive impairment. The third is typically used for severe psychiatric conditions and has no indication in his medical history. The room went silent. Diane's face drained of color. There must be some mistake. I've been getting everything from his pharmacy. The pharmacist shook her head. These medications were filled at 3 different pharmacies using prescriptions that appear to have been called in by someone claiming to be his doctor. We're investigating how that happened. I looked at Diane. You've been drugging him, keeping him sedated and confused so he couldn't question what you were doing. She stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to these accusations. I've done everything for him. Everything. And this is how I'm repaid? She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. The security guard stepped in front of her. Ma'am, I need you to stay here. The hospital administrator wants to speak with you. 2 police officers arrived 30 minutes later. They'd been called by Adult Protective Services based on the hospital's findings. They interviewed my father first, then me, then Diane separately. My father was groggy and struggled to give clear answers, but he confirmed he'd been feeling increasingly confused and unable to make decisions on his own. I provided all my documentation and the timeline of isolation. Diane maintained she'd done nothing wrong and was being victimized by a vindictive stepdaughter who resented her relationship with my father. The detective in charge looked at the medication evidence and the financial records the hospital had flagged. She told Diane she was being detained for questioning regarding suspected elder abuse and fraud. Diane's composure finally cracked. She started crying and insisting she loved my father and only wanted to take care of him. The detective was unmoved. They took her away in handcuffs while my father watched in stunned silence. When they were gone, he looked at me with tears streaming down his face. I didn't know. I thought she loved me. I sat with him and held his hand while he cried. I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have pushed harder to see you. I should have known something was wrong. He shook his head weakly. She was very convincing. After your mother died, I was so lonely. Diane made me feel cared for. By the time I realized she was controlling everything, I didn't have the strength to fight back. The medications made it impossible to think clearly. I promised him we'd get through this together and he'd never be isolated again. Over the next week, the investigation expanded. Detectives discovered Diane had accessed my father's bank accounts and transferred over $80,000 to accounts in her name. She'd taken out credit cards in his name and maxed them out on purchases for herself. The medications had been obtained through forged prescriptions she'd called into pharmacies claiming to be his doctor's office. She'd systematically cut off his contact with friends and family to prevent anyone from noticing what she was doing. The evidence was overwhelming. My father's doctor adjusted his medications, and within days, his cognitive function improved dramatically. He remembered things more clearly and could articulate what had been happening to him. He told police that Diane had been pressuring him to add her name to his house deed and update his will to leave everything to her. He'd resisted at first, but the medications made him too confused to fight effectively. She'd convinced him that I didn't care about him and would try to take his money if given the chance. Every lie had been calculated to isolate him further. The district attorney charged Diane with elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and obtaining controlled substances through deception. The judge denied bail based on the severity of the charges and the evidence she'd been systematically exploiting a vulnerable adult. My father filed for divorce immediately, and his lawyer worked to freeze all joint accounts and reverse fraudulent transactions. The recovery process would take months, but at least it had started. I took a leave of absence from work to help coordinate my father's care. He moved into a rehabilitation facility to continue recovering from the stroke and regain his strength. His doctors said the medications Diane had been giving him had likely contributed to his declining health and may have even triggered the stroke. Without those drugs in his system, he was alert and engaged again. He asked about friends he hadn't seen in years and wanted to reconnect with the life Diane had stolen from him. Richard visited frequently and brought other old friends who were shocked by what had happened. They all said they'd suspected something was wrong, but Diane had been so convincing in her excuses. My father apologized repeatedly to everyone for pushing them away. They assured him none of it was his fault, and they were just glad he was recovering. Watching him rebuild those connections made me realize how completely Diane had dismantled his entire support system. The trial happened 6 months later. I sat in the courtroom every day watching Diane try to maintain her victim narrative. The prosecution presented the medication evidence, the financial records, and testimony from my father, his doctors, and the hospital staff. Her defense claimed she'd been acting in my father's best interest, and any financial irregularities were misunderstandings. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and found her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution. My father and I left the courthouse together, and he looked lighter than he had in years. "It's finally over," he said. I squeezed his arm. "Now we can focus on moving forward." He'd regained most of his physical strength, and his mind was sharp again. He'd moved into a small apartment near me, and we had dinner together twice a week. He'd rejoined his poker group and started volunteering at a senior center. The life Diane had tried to destroy was being rebuilt piece by piece. One evening over dinner, he thanked me for not giving up on him. "You saved my life, Vanessa. If you hadn't fought to see me that day, I don't know what would have happened." I told him I'd always fight for him. That's what family does. We talked about my mother and how much she'd loved him. He said he felt guilty for letting Diane manipulate him so soon after losing her. I reminded him that predators target people when they're vulnerable, and none of this was his fault. He squeezed my hand across the table and smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw my real father looking back at me. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.